Hello and welcome to course number 81060, Configuring Dynamics 365. My name is Derek Borman and I will be your instructor. So this is actually the companion course to Customizing Microsoft Dynamics 365. So over the course of this course, we want to just talk about the concepts around what do you do when configuring the application. And so a lot of this stuff is going to go hand in hand with some of the baseline customization principles that you'll be working with as part of your Dynamics 365 organization. So we want to look at topics that include just an overview of how the configuration process works in Dynamics 365. So what are some of the administrative settings, business settings, and items that you'll be looking at? We also want to spend some time going in and really looking at the security model as a whole. So how are you setting up things like business units and users and teams, and how do those work in conjunction with things like security roles and access levels and privileges, so you can define not only what the users are doing inside the application or able to do inside the application, but also what's going to be presented to them and what they're going to be able to see as they're working through. We're also going to introduce the hierarchical security options. So if you need a little bit more security based around who that person is and what specific people they supervise inside an organization, you can implement hierarchical security either at a managerial level or at a position level to give yourself a little bit more flexibility around your security structure. We're also going to talk about how the knowledge management process works from a configuration standpoint. Because when you think about how knowledge management works, it's not necessarily just about service anymore. Knowledge management plays a role in any number of different facets of an application, whether you're doing employee self-service, whether you're doing customer self-service, gamification, any number of different situations. So we want to talk specifically about how that knowledge management piece relates to Dynamics 365 and what the setup procedures are around that. We're also going to look at processes and introduce you to some of the different workflows and dialogue capabilities inside the application. Now, there are other courses out there that delve a little bit more into these types of things, but we want to talk specifically on how they relate to a Dynamics 365 organization and what some of the baseline processes are that you'll use as you're working forward. We're also going to look at business process flows, and one of the exciting things that's been released with Dynamics 365 is the ability to use kind of a visual designer on your business process flows. So we'll look at how those are set up, how you tie those to specific entities, what some of the requirements are, and how that structure of that business process flow might affect what users are seeing as they're navigating through the application. And then finally, we're going to start looking at how Dynamics 365 and Office 365 work together. That line between the two individual applications is really starting to kind of get blurred when you start talking about OneDrive integration and SharePoint integration and even bringing in things like OneNote and Yammer and some of those things. So we want to talk about some of the baseline things that you'll set up from a configuration process inside the application as well. So all of this is going to be kind of combined together with some of the customization stuff that's available in other courses to really help you build and structure a nice Dynamics 365 organization that you can use for yourself, your customers, or any situation moving forward. So in this module, we want to start looking at some of the baseline building blocks that you're going to use for configuring your environment. It's more than just going in and defining how you're going to do SharePoint integration and some of those things. You really want to understand what your business is going to be using Dynamics 365 as for a whole. How are your records coming into the application? Are they going to be imported in from other sources? If so, how are you going to handle requirements around records? How are you going to handle that import process? How are you going to handle duplicate detection? If you're working in an environment where you need to have people really consistently looking at who's making changes and what changes were made, are you going to enable auditing? How do your fiscal year settings align with some of the goal situations that you would be working with? And so we really want to take a look at how that all plays together, as well as some of the baseline functionality around setting up your overall users and baseline security structure inside the application. So in this module, we're going to just look at kind of an overview as far as configuring Dynamics 365, talk about some of the different areas of the application that you can go in, and some of the baseline settings that are available inside there. We're going to introduce the concept of business units from a Dynamics 365 standpoint and really looking at how those business units are going to be the cornerstone for what you're going to do from a security infrastructure inside the application. We're going to talk a little bit about user management and setting up email configuration for your individual users. So again, user management, depending upon the type of deployment that you're working with, specifically from a Dynamics 365 standpoint, is really going to start with Office 365, setting up your users inside that application, assigning them Dynamics 365 licenses, and then going into the application and assigning them specific security roles to ensure that they can use the application. And then depending upon what you're working with, how you're going to go out and send up, email configuration and set up mailboxes so people can send and receive email regardless of how they're using email inside the application. And then we'll also talk just a little bit about how you use Teams to extend functionality, because in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily just going to be a user that's going to be working with this individual information. It might be a team of users. You might have people collaborating on an opportunity. And so in those situations, what does the team structure look like, and how are those teams going to translate into what you would be looking at inside the application? So every Dynamics 365 organization that you work with is going to have some unique business settings that you can tweak per environment that you're working through. And so what I want to do is talk just a little bit about what those items are. Now, many of these, when you start talking about some of the data management settings, collaboration settings, and document management settings, many of these will actually get into in much more detail throughout the course of this actual course itself. But I want to just start with kind of an overview as far as where some of the baseline items will be that you'll be working with. And those really break down into kind of the 5 areas that you see here. You've got your administrative settings, which is really going to have more of your generalized setup areas for the organization that you're working with. This is going to have things like subscription management if you're working with Dynamics 365 online. This is going to have some of your auto number settings. This is also going to have some of your baseline system settings that you can go in and configure inside the application itself. When we start talking about business management settings, we're talking about anything that is specific to the business itself. And a lot of the items that you'll see in here are going to correlate with things like fiscal year settings and items like that. We'll also talk a little bit about data management settings, and this is where you can handle things like turning on sample data. This is where you can handle some of the duplicate detection options that are available inside the application, as well as working with things like document management for SharePoint, OneNote integration, and then we'll talk about some of the collaboration settings that are available, specifically when we start talking about Yammer and social engagement integration and some of those items. Now, on top of that, we'll also start looking at things like security, and we'll start looking at things like auditing. But this is kind of an overview in regards to what some of the baseline items that you would be seeing. So let's first just talk about your administrative settings configuration. So all of your administrative items that you're going to set up are going to be organization specific. So you do need to keep in mind that some of these items do transfer over as part of the solution process, but many of these have to be set up and configured from the inside the application. And so this is going to be things like system settings, and we'll take you in here in just a second and show you from a demonstration standpoint what you might do inside the system settings scenario. This is where you can also look to see notifications and resources that are available to you, workflows and items that are taking place inside the organization, as well as auto number settings. Now, Dynamics 365 doesn't necessarily have a traditional auto number setting as much as it does for specialized items like cases and campaigns where they use a very specific numbering convention. You do have a little bit of flexibility over how you're going to control what that numbering convention looks like, but this gives you a little baseline capabilities to see what you want to do with that as far as going through. Now, the other option that you'll see is your business management settings. Now, you don't do as much with business management settings as we have in the past with this application, just because a lot of the things have become standalone features, but each organization will have kind of its own unique set of business operation procedures and policies that they may need to configure. Now, a couple of things that you want to look at from this business management setting. This is usually your company setup type situation. So, when are you closed from an organization standpoint? What services do you provide if you're using service scheduling? Where are you providing your services out of? Probably the biggest ones that you want to look at in here from an application standpoint are going to be things like your fiscal year settings, your sites, your currencies, your goal metrics. Those are going to be some of the baseline items, as well as the automatic record and configuration rules. Kind of what we usually tell people on this is a good rule of thumb is this is usually stuff that you kind of set up initially as far as your organization goes, and then you just kind of adjust it as necessary. So if your fiscal year settings change, you come in and you kind of set those up. Or if you're going to be doing some different goal tracking functionality, you would then go in and set up some different goal metrics based upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Now, the other thing to remember with this, and we'll talk more about this when we get into security roles, is business management settings are really a administrative type situation. So you do have to have the appropriate rights inside your organization to be able to facilitate this, and that's usually done through security role setup inside the application. Data management is where you can handle how the data is actually going to be interacted with inside the application. And again, we'll take you in here in just a few minutes and show you a couple of demonstrations on this. But some of the biggest ones would be like your duplicate detection settings. So for example, if you want to limit the potential for somebody entering the same account into the application more than once, the duplicate detection rules and settings are where you can actually go in and define what those rules look like. Are you doing a comparison on the account name and email address, or are you taking into consideration the account number? What are going to be the fields that you're going to use to define whether or not this is a duplicate record inside the application itself? And the nice thing about the duplicate detection settings is this is also where you would have the capabilities to go in and actually run this at kind of a high level. So instead of having it plug that information in as the information is being entered, you could just do kind of a manual duplicate detection job to see if there's any existing duplicates based upon how you've configured information moving forward. This is also where you can handle some of your data maps. So a lot of times what you'll be doing is importing information into the application. And when you're importing information in, depending upon where it's coming from, maybe like an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, you may or may not know how you want to put that information or what specific fields you want to put that information into inside Dynamics 365. This allows you to set up reusable mappings that you can use for any imports that you will be doing as part of the application. And then once those imports have actually been run, the imports areas where you can go in and actually see, okay, what's the status of that import job? How many records have been imported in? Am I having any issues? Am I having any items that I need to be aware of as part of that situation? This is also where you'll be able to do things like bulk delete. If you want to do kind of a mass delete on records, you can set up kind of reusable job criteria that you want to work with and then delete this information accordingly. This is also where you can go in and turn on or off sample data. So if you're trying to get just an overview as far as what's available inside the application, sample data is kind of a nice way to do that because it'll already have some accounts and some cases and some opportunities set up in there. But then obviously once you're ready to go, typically you come in and kind of turn that process off, as well as things like ready to use business processes. And we'll talk more about business process flows when we get into the business process module. A couple of things that you want to just keep in mind when you start talking about, duplicate detection and data import. Duplicate detection, you have to be a little careful of to make sure that you don't have very generic rules when you're creating it. So try to find rules that are going to be more specific. I want to look at a combination of the account name, the account number, and the email address. If it's just, an email address or just an account name, sometimes if they're too generic, you'll get a lot of potential duplicate records coming into the application where they may or may not specifically be duplicate records. And that really can frustrate your users when they're working through it. So just make sure that, and we'll talk a little bit about this as you set this information up, make sure that you set this information up as specific as possible. And also keep in mind that when you are setting up duplicate detection jobs as far as scheduling to see if there are duplicates in the system, you do have the capabilities to schedule those, but you can only schedule those between 7 and 365 days. Now, as far as the data import works, there's a lot of ways to get information inside a Dynamics 365 environment. Data import is really good for small volume type situations where you have data that's reasonably clean. There isn't a lot of maintenance that has to be done on that situation. If you have to do a lot of data that maybe has to be mapped or parsed or something like that, there's different utilities out there that would give you the capabilities to do that. Think of data import as very simplistic. I'm only only working with, text files, CSV files, XML spreadsheets as far as putting information in. If I have multiple files, I can actually put those into a zip file to move them through, but I'm really looking more at just kind of small based information when I'm going through. And I also want to keep in mind that any information that I'm bringing into there from an individual file standpoint can be no more than 8 megabytes in size. So as long as you're remembering some of those kind of key facts from a data import perspective, the data import can be a really nice utility to get you started and kind of moving in the right direction from that standpoint. Another option that you have, and we'll delve into this as part of the demo as well, is auditing. Now, auditing is nice if you want to make sure that people, who's making what changes inside the system. Not only can you control what's being audited inside the application, but once auditing's been turned on, you can actually go into the logs and you can see who made what change at what time. Now, auditing is one of those things where it has to be kind of turned on at a few different levels. It has to be enabled, for the entire organization first. Once it's enabled for the entire organization, then you basically go in and specify what specific entities you want to audit inside the application. So I want to audit the account entity or the contact entity. And then once you've enabled it at an entity level, then the fields will actually start getting edited based upon, or audited based upon, what items we've chosen for each individual field. And again, we'll go in and do just a little bit of a demo here in a few minutes so you can see kind of how auditing works. The big thing to remember with auditing is I wouldn't call this like a compliance solution. I would call this as I want to have a snapshot in regards to who's made what change on what day and what that change was. If I really need to go in and start, controlling things from a compliance perspective, auditing isn't necessarily the best solution for that, but it can act as a very nice starting point to get you moving in the right direction as far as keeping track of what changes are being made inside the system. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time on document management towards the end of this course, but this is where you're really going to start getting in and configuring your integration with SharePoint. Now, there's two types of SharePoint integration that's supported. There's client-side SharePoint integration, and then there's server-side SharePoint integration. Now, from a server-side perspective, that's also going to give you some additional functionalities such as OneNote integration, OneDrive integration, Delve integration. Those give you a lot more flexibility. And that's where you're really starting to see from a trend perspective people moving. But again, we want to at least mention here's where you have the capabilities to turn on SharePoint integration. So if you want to have a document library that's associated with a specific record inside the application, this is where you can turn that on and define what those functionalities look like. And then you have the ability to actually go out and do some additional extensive integration with those if you're a developer. But we're going to talk more about some of the baseline functionality, specifically when we get more into the Office 365 and Dynamics 365 integration module. And then finally, the other aspect that really starts to come into a Dynamics 365 organization is this whole concept of collaboration. Do I want to bring information in from other areas? A good example of that is the activity feed in CRM that kind of tells you, who's done what inside an individual record inside the application. So one of the things that you have the capabilities to do is actually replace that activity feed with like an integration to a Yammer Enterprise subscription. And this is where you can go in and you can actually configure and use Yammer groups inside the Dynamics 365 subscription. And these could be public groups, private groups. We'll talk more about what that process looks like again when we get into the Office 365 integration module, as well as we could talk about things like social engagement and how you tie some of that information together. But this is kind of a quick little overview in regards to some of the baseline areas that you would be seeing from a configuration inside the application standpoint. So let's take a little bit of time and just kind of explore what some of these baseline configuration options look like inside the application. So as you can see, we're kind of at your main screen that you would see when you open up a Dynamics 365 subscription. But we're going to just go ahead and we're going to head into settings first. So when I click on settings, I can see there's a lot of different options. There's some around kind of business management. This is going to have my templates as well as some of my product catalog information. I've got my customizations area, which is really going to be more from a customization perspective. But then I get into things like my system area, which is going going to have my administration and my document management, my auditing, email configuration, more of the baseline functionality that you would be looking at inside the organization. Now let's first and foremost kind of start with the administration option. So I'm going to click on administration, and I can see this is where that has some of the baseline options that we've kind of talked about. Now this is a Dynamics 365 online environment, so one of the first areas that we can see in here is subscription management. So this is where I can go in if I need to purchase additional licenses for users, if I want to set up payment plans, if I want to assign licenses to users, or just have kind of an overall look at my Dynamics 365 subscription. This is where I can do that. Now, in order to actually be able to facilitate some of those tasks, typically I would have to be a system administrator on my Office 365 subscription as well in order to be able to work through that. But that's where I could go in and manage some of my subscription-based functionality. The other thing that you'll see in here is my system settings, and this is probably the biggest one that I wanted to show you inside here, because this is where I can manage kind of the overall system settings for the application as a whole. This is going to have things like just kind of general usage as far as am I going to allow IAM information, what is going to be my currency precision, if I want to do blocked file extensions for attachments, which options do I want to work with from there. If I have my own Bing Maps functionality, this is where I can enable Bing Maps integration. If I want to do telephony with like Skype or Skype for Business, this is where I can facilitate that from kind of a click to dial functionality. So my general settings is going to have a lot of kind of my custom help information. This is what's going to have my integration with social engagement, whether or not users see the welcome screen. This is just kind of the generalized information that you would see inside the application itself. Now, the other thing that you're going to see in here is your email integration, and we'll talk more about email here in just a little bit, but this is where, as an organization, I can set up kind of my default items for the organization as far as how we're going to handle email processing. Am I going to have people using Outlook to handle email processing? Am I going to be using server-side synchronization or even the email router to a certain degree? What are some of my options around that when I'm working through it? When I start getting into things like reporting, a couple of things that you'll see in here is this is where I can classify my reports and define how I want my reporting structure to work. But this is also where I would have the capabilities to turn on Power BI visuals. So one of the things that's now available with Dynamics 365 is the ability to associate this and attach this to a Power BI subscription. And once you attach this to a Power BI subscription, you now have the capabilities to take tiles and items that are inside Power BI and surface them inside Dynamics 365 dashboards. And in order to be able to facilitate and do that, you would have to turn this functionality on. So this would be an option where you would enable this, and now you would be able to consume that information inside your organization. This is also going to have just kind of generalized situations around goals and goal tracking, how often you want your goals to be rolled up, your sales information, whether or not how the records are going to interact with that information. This is also where you can work with your preview functionality. If you want to do mobile client settings for your organization, this is where you can set up kind of on-demand metadata syncing. This is where also, if you have any preview functionality that you would want to turn on from an organization standpoint, this is where you could enable any of the specific preview functionality. Things like Organization Insights, Cortana for Dynamics 365, some of your app design modules, so your new application designer that ships as part of Dynamics 365, the overall functionality that you would be looking at. So now in here, from our standpoint, if I just come down into here and I want to say that we're going to see the Dynamics 365 message, we're just going to turn that off, and then we'll just go ahead and turn off the welcome screen as well. And then we can go ahead and click on OK. So these are just kind of my default functionalities as far as system settings. So I would definitely highly recommend setting some of this information up as you're moving forward. Also from in here, this is where if I wanted to do Yammer configuration as well as social engagement configuration, this is where I could facilitate some of that as well. Now we'll show you that in a little bit more detail when we get into the Office 365 Dynamics 365 module. But let's go ahead and let's look at the business management piece here as well. So if I click on business management, this is where I can see kind of my fiscal year settings. So if I want to go ahead and click on fiscal year settings, this is where I can define where I'm going to be using that, primarily from a goal tracking perspective. But this gives me the capabilities to see, what is going to be my fiscal year? What do I want to use from an abbreviation standpoint? Am I more on kind of a quarterly basis from a fiscal year standpoint? Am I at monthly? How am I defining what these situations are? And then how do I want this information to display inside the application? Again, if you're doing anything in regards to goals or items around goal tracking, the fiscal year settings here really give you a lot of flexibility to be able to kind of define and configure that. The other option that we talked a little bit about was the data management process. And let's go ahead and take a look at the data management process inside the application. So I'm going to go into Settings and Data Management. And probably the biggest things that you'll see in here, like I said, is your imports, your data maps, but your duplicate detection settings. And so if you're looking at how you want to, handle duplicate records inside the application, this is where I can define what those look like inside my organization. So when I go into my duplicate detection settings, this is where I can actually set up kind of my default rules. So when do I want the duplicate detection functionality to work at from the inside the application? Do I want it to take place when a record is created or updated? Do I want to look at it when the Dynamics 365 for Outlook goes from offline to online? Or do I want to handle it during a data import? I can really just turn this functionality on from an organization standpoint, and then any one of these combinations I can define how I want to set this information up. And this is very nice. I would look at a little bit in regards to maybe initially, particularly if you're coming in from an older system that you didn't have a lot of duplicate detection options on. Maybe you turn it off for import initially so you can get the data into the environment, and then you can kind of configure your duplicate detection rules from there. And then one of the options that you see over here on the side is this duplicate detection jobs. And this is where I could kind of manually come in and run those duplicate detection jobs if necessary. Now the rules themselves, if I cancel out of here and go into the rules themselves are where I can define for specific entities what that process looks like. So this is where I can see, for the account perspective, what specific fields are we going to be looking at and trying to map out to try to determine which one of these individual items is moving forward. So for example, let's just go ahead and open up this option here. So I can see in here that this is going out and it's looking for accounts with the same account name. It's basing the information on the account entity, and it's matching it on the account record as well. So you define kind of a base record type and a matching record type. And then you come down into here and you would specify for each individual option what specific scenario you would want to look at. So in this case, we're looking at the account name field and we're looking for an exact match. And so if it has an exact match, if spelling is exactly the same, it's going to deem that as a matched record inside the application. Now, one of the things that you'll see in here is you have to publish these. So even though you define these individual rules and items, you cannot, or they will not take into effect into the system until you specifically publish them. Now let's just look at this from another aspect. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new one here. And I'll see that I have different record types that I can choose from. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and I'll choose account. I'll look for a matching record type of account. I'm going to call this Derek's sample. And then I'll come down into here and I'll pick what specific field I want to work with. So in this case, we want to look for account name, and we want to look for either exact match, same first characters or last characters. Let's do exact match. And then let's come down here and also do email address. And we'll do it exact match on this as well. Now this is an additive situation, so as I define each one of these items, it's going to be looking at each one as a whole and then defining those specific situations from a matching perspective in here. So this just gives me a little bit of flexibility. Once I'm ready to deploy this, now I can go ahead and hit save and close. Then I could publish this rule, and this would now take live in effect inside the system itself. Let's also take a look at the auditing situation. So I'm going to just close out of my rule here, and I'm going to go into settings and I'm going to go into auditing. So this is where you have all of your auditing capabilities inside a Dynamics 365 organization. Now the big thing to remember with auditing is really kind of a three-tier scenario. It has to be enabled at kind of 3 levels before you can actually go in and use it inside the application. So the first area that you see in here is the global audit settings. So when I go ahead and click on global audit settings, this is really just going to take me to the auditing tab inside system settings. And so this is where I now have the capabilities to determine what it is that I want to audit inside the application. So the first thing that I have to do is I have to start auditing. And when I start auditing, now I can define what specific items inside the application I want to audit. Now, one of the first options I have here is audit user access. So this is where I can kind of audit who's going in and accessing what information inside the application. And this is really just kind of an all or none situation when you're setting this up. The next option that you see in here is the individual entities or areas. So these are really just broken down by those areas inside CRM. So when you think about things like common entities, this is going to be things like your account, your contact, your lead, your product, things that are going to be used throughout the application itself. They're not necessarily functionality specific. So they're not sales specific or marketing specific. When you start talking about sales related entities, now we're getting into things that are sales specific, opportunities, quotes, orders, invoices. Now what I can do here is I can just check this box here, and if I check this box, it's automatically going to go in and set each one of these items that you see here, account, contact, goal metric, lead, all of this information to auditable. Now that isn't necessarily what you always want. So the other option that you have is you can just turn this on, and then at an individual entity by entity basis, you could actually go in and then start auditing some of those individual fields and entities. Now I'm going to, for right now, just go ahead and uncheck common entities. Just turn on auditing at an application level. Then I'll go ahead and click on OK. Then I'm going to come into this entity and audit field settings. And this is where I will click on kind of this option. And really this is just going to open up kind of my customizations area inside the application. And so this is where I can define for what specific entities I want to work with, whether or not I want to enable auditing. So for example, if I come over to the account entity and I click on the account entity, this will open up the entity definition for the account entity. And one of the options that we'll see in here is auditing. And so once I turn on auditing at an account level, now I will actually be auditing any fields inside the application that have been set for auditing. So now I come down into data services and I enable auditing. And now what this kind of tells me here is really all the fields inside this particular option are going to be enabled for auditing. So by default, once you turn it on at a system level and then an entity level, you're really auditing everything for that particular entity. If I wanted to, I could come into here and then I would have the capabilities to come down into the individual fields. Let me save this here real quick. I could then come into the individual fields, and these individual fields will tell me whether or not they're actually being audited as part of the application. Now again, most fields will be audited. There's going to be some fields like lookup fields and some of those things that just by sheer nature aren't necessarily audited, but most fields will be audited. Now the way that auditing works is it only flags for an audit record if information in that specific field has changed. So even though it's set up for auditing, if somebody hasn't gone in and actually done something to that particular field, that information will not be included in the audit record itself. Now I'm going to maximize this, and I can see right in here where it says audit status enabled. This is what's showing me what specific fields are being enabled for auditing. If I don't want to, for example, audit the city field, I could go ahead, double click on this. It'll open up the field definition. I could just basically set this from auditing enabled to auditing disabled, and then it will not audit this information even if it changes inside the application. Now the other option that I could do is I could just select multiple fields, and then once I select multiple fields, then I have an option in here to hit edit, and this will open up kind of a generalized process, and this is where I could turn on or disable auditing for all of the selected fields that I have. But the big thing to remember is once you have auditing turned on, then it's going to go out, and anytime a change is made, it's going to register that inside the system. And then this audit summary view will then show you an overall list of everything that's happened inside the application. So when somebody's made changes, when somebody's added an entity, any of those types of things, so you can see specifically what's happened inside the application. Now again, use auditing kind of to your best situation. I would really recommend it does take up a fair amount of system resources at time. So if you are going to audit, make sure that you are very targeted in whatever it is that you are auditing. But auditing can be a very nice way to just get kind of a snapshot view in regards to what's taking place. Now, the final piece to this to this configuration area is your document management. And again, we'll get into this in much more detail as we move forward, but this is where if you want to set up like your SharePoint integration, this is where we can define if we're going to use server-based SharePoint integration or just kind of the list component as a whole. And this is where we can actually set up, OneNote integration, OneDrive integration. And again, when we get into the Dynamics 365, Office 365 area, we'll show you these. But these are just some baseline configuration things that you can do as an organization to kind of get the initial things set up and ready to go as you start moving forward. So one of the first things that you have to look at from a Dynamics 365 perspective is security. And when we talk about security, there's a lot of factors that play into security as a whole. Those are going to be things like, who are your users? How are they logging into the system? What records should they have access to inside the application itself? Are you going to have, groups of users or teams that are going to be able to go in and either own records together or be used to facilitate other functionality inside the application like record sharing and field security profiles. These are all different aspects that you need to kind of keep in mind, as well as security roles and business unit settings and hierarchical settings. These are all aspects that really tie into the overall underlying security of how a Dynamics 365 implementation is going to take place. So if you go into settings and security, it'll take you right to this tab. And this is where you can really manage all facets of the security structure that you're going to be working with as part of the application. So over the rest of this module and into subsequent modules, we're going to spend a lot of time inside this area here defining all the different necessary points from a security structure standpoint. Now, one of the first things that you have to kind of keep in mind when you start talking about security is what are called business units. And so a business unit is really a framework for how your organization is going to be structured as a whole. And a business unit contains the underlying core security principles for your application. So it's going to typically consist of, users, teams, and security roles. And the combination of those kind of three elements are really going to be what's be used to define whether or not this user or a specific user has access to all records inside a Dynamics 365 deployment or just a specific subset of records inside a Dynamics 365 deployment. The nice thing about these business units is these are also what's going to define kind of the security boundaries. And so this is what's really going to determine whether or not I can see my records or other people's records inside the application. Now, when we start talking about business units, there's really two types of business units in a Dynamics 365 environment. There's what's called the root business unit, and so that's really the top level business unit, and you'll see that on the next slide here in just a second. But that's the one that gets created automatically when an organization is deployed, and this is going to be kind of the top underlying structure of your organization. And then from there, you're going to have what are called child business units, and child business units will basically represent other business units inside your hierarchy. I always like to tell people, think of it like an organization chart. At an organization chart, you might have these different top tier items that you'll be looking at and then the individual departments that kind of work their way down. It's that same similar concept. It doesn't necessarily have to match your organization chart. It might be something based upon different items inside your system, but it's kind of a nice starting point that you can be working with. Now, let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So this is kind of your root business unit. So let's just say, for example, that I've installed and created a Dynamics 365 organization for Adventure Work Cycles. When I do that, it's going to create the root business unit for Adventure Work Cycles that I can see inside the application. Now, because this is my underlying root business unit, the big thing to remember is this has to always be the top tier business unit in my organization. I cannot have any other business units that are on top of this or that are are parents of this particular item. The other thing is this always has to be enabled from an application standpoint. So I do not have the capabilities to go in and disable this or anything like that. Now I can rename it if I don't want to call it Adventure Work Cycles. I certainly could call it something else, but it has to exist and it has to be the top tier option that I would be working with. From there, I can start creating child business units. And so this is a real good example of where you might see from a child business perspective. Now I've got different departments. I've got my sales department, I've got my marketing department, and then I've got my service department. But think of it as, however your organization structure might be set up. It might be territories. You might have the Northern Territory, the Southern Territory, East and West. You might have regions. You might have North America. You might have EMEA, Asia, those types of different situations. Every organization is going to be a little bit different. So you have to really define, okay, what's my underlying structure for how we're going to compartmentalize these individual groups of users and teams, and then you can name these business units accordingly. And so the nice thing about these business units is even if you set them up initially, if you decide, okay, sales isn't really what I want to call this, I can always come back later and I can rename them. I can always disable them or I can delete them, and I can move them around. So like you'll see here, I also have underneath sales, I have channel sales and I have consumer sales, and under service I have support and I have projects. The concept being here that consumer sales is going to have all of the users and or teams that work specifically in consumer sales. Channel sales is going to have all the users and teams that work in channel sales, and so on and so forth. And sales might consist of my managers for the individual channel sales, consumer sales area. These will now be the boundaries that will be defined from a security standpoint inside the application. Now, if I wanted to, I could always move channel sales somewhere else if I felt like that was a necessary part of the application. But this is where I can really start setting up and defining what this security structure looks like as a whole from inside my Dynamics 365 organization. So let's go ahead and take a look at this security information. And again, we're going to spend a lot of time in this area between this module and the next several modules. But we'll go ahead and we'll go into settings and we'll go into security. And so you can see I have my users, my teams. Let's first talk about the business units. And realistically, if you're new to Dynamics 365 and you're looking to kind of set up a security structure, business units is where you want to start. You want to make sure that you have your business units defined first, because when you create new users and new items inside the application, those users are going to have to be associated with a specific business unit. You always can move users from one business unit to another. However, it's not necessary. There's additional things that sometimes have to happen. So it's always easiest if you can have the business units defined first, and then you can always go in and kind of create users from there and then start associating them with specific business units inside the application. Now in this case, I'll just go ahead and click on business units. And I can see that I have kind of a baseline business unit for my organization. So this one just happens to be a Dynamics 365 instance that has kind of a numeric number next to it. This is where I could now go in and start kind of defining different business units underneath here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, since this is my root business unit, is I can go ahead and I can click on new, and we'll just kind of create that same structure that we just saw on the previous slide. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new business unit called sales. And I don't need a ton of information here. I can add some additional information like phone numbers and address if I want to, but realistically the only thing that I have to have here is the name of the business unit and then what the parent business unit is going to be. All the other information is really more from just kind of a reporting capabilities inside the application. So here I've got sales. I'm going to go ahead and hit the Save and New button, and this is going to create another new business unit that I can use, and I'll just call this one Service, and then I'll create another one called Marketing. So we'll call this Service, and Save and New. And then I will create one called Channel Sales and Consumer Sales. Now, on this consumer sales, I'm going to go ahead and click on my parent business unit, and I'm going to click on Look Up More Records, and I'm actually going to change this consumer sales to use sales as the parent business unit. So now I can see that the parent business unit has been assigned to sales. Now I'll go ahead and hit save and close. Now, I didn't do that when I created the initial channel sales, and so I realistically would probably have wanted channel sales to be part of the sales scenario. So one of the things that I can do after the fact is I can click on channel sales, I can go to more actions, and there's an option here to change parent business unit. I click on change parent business unit, pick the business unit I want to work with, and now I can go ahead and choose sales, and that'll reparent this particular item for me. So this is a great way that, as you're setting this information up, you can kind of define how you want this information to work. So again, I'll just go ahead and I'll add one more here for service. We'll call this portals. And I'll set this parent business unit here as service. And then save and close. But this is a very important aspect and kind of the first critical piece to what you're doing from a security structure. Once your business units are in place, then you can go in and start handling the next tier to this, which is going to be your users, teams, and then ultimately start defining security access based upon security roles and other individual items within the application. Ultimately, the people accessing the application are going to be what are called users. And when you talk about user authentication from a Dynamics 365 perspective, there's really two ways that that's kind of handled. It's always handled through an external authentication provider, but if you're still kind of using an on-premise deployment, it uses your Active Directory for your local instance to authenticate that user to Dynamics 365. And then once they're authenticated, then it uses the Dynamics 365 security model to access how they control what they're doing inside the application. The other option, if you're using Dynamics 365 online, is it uses the Office 365 authentication to authenticate the user. Once they're authenticated, then again, they have to be assigned a specific security role and item inside the application to be able to access it. So you do really need to kind of think about, who your users are going to be and making sure that your users are added to the appropriate area so you can work with them. Now, from an on-premise perspective, if you're using kind of a traditional aspect, that will use their domain account. So they will have kind of an Active Directory account that will be created, so you have to add them into Active Directory. Once you add them into Active Directory, then you can go ahead and add them into Dynamics 365. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can either add individual users just by going in and clicking on the new button, defining what their Active Directory login is. It'll pick that information up, and then you can work with it from there. Or there's kind of a wizard that allows you to go in and select multiple users from your organization and then add them and deploy them as part of the application. But either way, you do have to assign those users and associate them with a Dynamics 365 standpoint, and it is more of a manual process. And when you create the user, you have to define whether or not they belong to what specific business unit, and then typically have to assign them a security role. Now, we're not going to mess with on-premise too much at this point. We're really going to focus on online because that's from a Dynamics 365 standpoint where you're seeing a lot more of the deployments take place. And so let's just talk about kind of that online perspective when you're working with it. So again, every user that's going to be accessing Dynamics 365 online has to have an Office 365 account. And so all of the authentication is done through that Office 365 account. So you do have to go in and add them as an Office 365 user first. Now, the next piece to this is you don't physically go into into Dynamics 365 and add them as a user. What you actually have to do is you have to go in and assign them a Dynamics 365 license through the portal. And then once you do that, then you will start to see them inside Dynamics 365, and then you can basically start moving them around. And when you do that, they will automatically belong to the root business unit inside the organization. You can switch them to whichever business unit you want, and then they will also not necessarily have a security role associated with them. You will have to add a security role, but we'll show you what that process looks like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the security role access here in just a second. So let's first look at how you would add a user and set them up to be a Dynamics 365 user. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to portal.office.com and you're going to log into your Office 365 Administrative Center using your Office 365 admin credentials. So obviously you do need to be a Office 365 system admin in order to be able to facilitate this functionality. But once you log into your administrative screen, you're going to see basically the Administrative Center that you see here. The first option that you're going to see is your users area. So this is where you can go in and add specific users to your organization. So when you click on active users, it'll show you all of your individual users. And now all you have to do is hit add. And when you hit add, it'll ask you for user credentials that you want to define. So in this case, we'll just go ahead and call this person Tony Smith. Give them a username. Now as I go through, I have some generalized information about what I can do with them. So if I wanted to kind of work through generalized contact information, I could add that. The password, this is where I can define what I want their password to be inside the application. I can either have the system auto-generate the password for them, or I can create the password automatically for them, and I will just go ahead and create the password for them. And then I will uncheck, in this case, make the user change their password just so we kind of have it as we're working through. Then I've got roles. This is where I can define different roles for the Office 365 administrative rights. Now in this case, it has nothing to do with what we're doing from a Dynamics 365 perspective, so I can just leave them as kind of a user, but if they were going to need to do some administrative tasks inside Office 365, this is where I could define those options. In this case, we'll just kind of leave it from here. The biggest thing that you have to look at is what you're looking at from a product standpoint. And so one of the options you're going to see down here is your Dynamics 365 licensing. So you'll come down into here, you'll pick your options for your Dynamics 365 licensing. You'll see that it does have all of your kind of additional options like marketing and social engagement and those options. Those you can just kind of leave on by default. Those are all based upon your actual subscription options that you've chosen. Then you can go ahead and hit add. And once you add, this will create the user. This will then send out the passwords and do everything that you need to do from that perspective. But this will create the user, make sure that they're ready to go inside the application, and then it will eventually create them inside your Dynamics 365 organization. It takes a few minutes for them to actually show up inside Dynamics 365, but once you've got them set up, they will then eventually show up in there and you can assign them a security role. Now let's flip that a little bit and look at what that process looks like inside Dynamics 365. So now I'm going to go over into Dynamics 365. I'm going to go into Settings and Security again, and I'm going to go over into Users. Now I don't necessarily see Tony at this point, and that's fine. It takes a little bit of time sometimes for that information to proceed over. But one of the things that I can see is as users are being added into this, there are different security roles that I can look at to kind of see who's working through options. And one of the options that I see here are users with no security roles assigned. And so now that I've clicked on users with no security roles assigned, Tony has now shown up in here because it's propagated across. So now I could go ahead and assign Tony a security role. Now we'll talk a little bit about what security roles are here in a little bit, but this is where now Tony's ready to go. He's a part of a business unit. You can see he's a part of our core business unit. If I wanted to, I could, from this perspective, I could go out and I could change his business unit to be a different business unit inside the application. So I could say he's actually going to be a member of sales. This will then change his business unit, and then I could assign them to a security role based upon those options. But this gives me kind of a nice starting point to create those users and then assign them security roles inside the application. A few other things just to kind of remember when it comes to users. Probably one of the biggest areas that we get questions on when we start kind of doing this, is particularly with newer organizations and newer people, is you do not have the ability to delete users. And that's very intentional, because if you think about it, users can own records inside the application, and if you delete a user, you might now have potentially all of these orphan users inside the application. And so one of the things to remember is you can disable users, and you can prevent users from actually logging into the system by disabling users. From an Office 365 perspective, if you don't want them to have a license anymore. You still need to go into the Office 365 administrative area and remove their licensing, but disabling a user will prevent them from accessing the system. So remember, if you have somebody that you no longer need to have access, you can't delete them. You do have to physically disable them and then go in and remove the license from there. As you saw what we did with Tony, I can change the business unit. I can move a user or a team from one business unit to another. One thing to remember, and we'll talk more about this when we get into the security module here, or the security role module here in a little bit, all security roles that are associated with that user are removed. And so when you move somebody from one business unit to another, they really don't have any access to the organization until you assign them a security role. Even if they already had a security role in their previous business unit, that's removed. Now, the process that we did of changing the business unit was pretty quick. Be aware that if you have somebody who's been in your organization for a while and now you change them from one business unit to another, that can take a fair amount of time. I've seen it take up to 5-10 minutes depending upon how many records they own and other factors inside the organization. So I do recommend that if you are going to change somebody's business unit that's been around for a while, probably try to do it, during off-peak hours or at a scenario where they're not going to be logged in. Because the other thing that takes place is if they're currently logged in when you change their business unit, that'll also increase the length of time that it takes to do that. But as soon as that process is complete, now they'll be locked out of the system because they won't have that new security role. So you definitely want to, if you're going to work with users and change their business units, do it, off-peak situations. It makes it much easier. And then the other situation is if you're using Dynamics 365 online, you can federate it with a local domain account. So instead of using Derek at test.onmicrosoft.com, if I have a local Microsoft.com domain that I want to use, I can do that. There's some additional setup that has to be done. You have to take their local Active Directory and you have to sync it with Azure Active Directory in order to be able to facilitate that. But the nice thing about that is now I can use my local domain to sign on with my Dynamics 365 online account. So there's a lot of different options around user standpoints and creating them. Just be aware that depending upon what environment you're working with, whether it's online or on-premise, there's different setup and configuration options that you might need to take into consideration. Another aspect that you need to keep in mind when you start talking about users and configuration from inside the application is the whole concept of email. So you think about how you might use email in a Dynamics 365 perspective. Obviously, you might have users who are sending and receiving emails to prospective customers as you're working through it, but you might also have situations where you start talking about users or queues sending and receiving emails as part of the application. So one of the first things that you have to do is you have to do kind of your email configuration. And so there's a few different options that are involved with email configuration inside a Dynamics 365 implementation. The first option is really setting up what are called your email server profiles. So this is where you define what type of email server you're going to be used to process information, particularly when you start talking about server-side synchronization. And server-side syncing is what's going to allow you to do things like Exchange folder syncing. This is what's going to give you a little bit more around some of your advanced email processing situations. This is where you might be seeing people, who are historically used the email router transitioning over into server-side synchronization. The nice thing about the email profile is you define what the server profile is, then you can define defaults for your organization. So then you can go into your configuration settings and you can define as an organization as a whole how you want to handle email processing. Then you can go in and you actually start defining mailbox information and what user is going to use what information from a mailbox perspective. The other option that you'll see in here is server-side synchronization processing. As you've enabled server-side syncing, this is where you would also have the capabilities to go in and define and see what's taking place from a performance perspective. And if you were using the email router and you decided to transition over into server-side syncing, this is where you would also have the capabilities to kind of migrate some of those processes. So what I want to do next is just take you into the application and show you how the email configuration piece works inside the application. So if I go into settings and email configuration, the first area that I'll see in here is my email server profiles. And so this is where I can define the different email server profiles that I'm working with from inside my organization. So the first thing that I see in here is Microsoft Exchange Online. And the reason why this one has been pre-created is because I'm using Dynamics 365 Online with an Office 365 subscription and Exchange Online. So the good thing is if that's your typical environment that you're working with, you don't have to go in and configure a server profile. If you're using kind of an on-premise version and you have an on-premise Exchange server, you would have to create and define a server profile that you would want to work with. Now in this case, we'll just go ahead and open up this generalized server profile. And so what I can see is here it tells me what type of server that I'm working with. And so this is where I could define, if it's an Exchange server, if it's a POP server, but this is where I can define what specific items I want to work with. And then depending upon what the situation is, I will also have the ability to define server addresses. So what is the URL of the server I want to work with? But being that this is an Exchange Online, I don't necessarily have to define a ton of information around this, but this is where I can set up the individual profile and define how that information is going to work. You have to have at least one profile set up in order for the organization to work. Once you have your profile set up, then you can start getting into the individual configuration as part of the application. Now, there's a couple of things that you want to consider. There's the individual mailbox perspective, and then there's the actual organization defaults as a whole. So if you remember when we were talking about administration and we went into some of the admin settings earlier, we had the ability to go in and look at that email area. This is where I can define kind of defaults for my organization around email processing as a whole. Now, this is taking just a little bit, so let's just go ahead and go into administration. So if I go into email configuration settings, this is where I can define my organization defaults. So the first thing that it says here is, how do I want to handle configuring email processing? So as an organization, I can determine whether or not I want to use server-side synchronization or the Dynamics 365 email router. Now, realistically, you're starting to see most organizations transition to server-side synchronization just because of the flexibility that it offers. There are going to be situations at some point in time where potentially the email router could be deprecated, but for the most part, as it exists today, it's still a viable option, but most of the areas that you're seeing here are around server-side synchronization. So the first thing that you have to say is, what's the default profile that I want to use? Now, we only have one server profile. That's that Exchange Online profile that was created for us automatically. But if we had multiple profiles, this is where I could specify kind of the default for the organization and then decide how I want to handle, incoming email processing, outgoing, so on and so forth. So incoming email processing, how do I want to handle that? Do I want to use Dynamics 365 for Outlook? Do I want to use server-side synchronization or the email router? How do I want to work with that? So you've got a couple of different options when you start talking about incoming. Incoming, you can use Outlook, you can use server-side synchronization or email router, or you could use a forwarding mailbox where it's being forwarded to one area first and then email activities are being created from there. Typically speaking, most of your users probably will be using the Outlook client in some perspective, so you'll usually use incoming as Dynamics 365 for Outlook. Outgoing, same type of situation, except for obviously since it's outgoing processing, we don't necessarily have the forward mailbox option, so I can either use 365 for Outlook, or I can use server-side synchronization or email router. This is specifically defined based upon what I've chosen up here for processing email, which in this case I've set as server-side synchronization. And then for appointments and tasks, it's kind of the same thing. Typically what we recommend from a best practice standpoint, usually if you're going to use the Outlook client, people will use their incoming profile with Outlook, their outgoing with server-side synchronization, and then their appointments, contacts, and tasks as Dynamics 365 for Outlook. If you're not using Outlook, then obviously server-side synchronization or email router for both incoming, outgoing, as well as appointments and tasks works. Then the reason why we recommend, if you're using the Outlook client, to use server-side synchronization for outgoing is because that way it'll just process it automatically if there's like a workflow that's generating an email. Otherwise, that person's Outlook physically has to be open in order for it to process that email. So you could run into situations where things aren't being processed in a timely fashion because the person's not logged into Outlook. It just kind of eliminates some of those different options available when you're working through it. But in this situation, now I have the capabilities, if I wanted to work with some of the other functionalities as far as like folder level tracking and some of those options. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and click on OK. And now the final stage to this would be the mailbox processing. So this is where I would go into my mailboxes, and as opposed to past situations where all of the email information was managed inside the user account, with Dynamics 365, each user or queue will have a specific mailbox record associated with it. And so this is what's going to define their mailbox associated with their user account. It's going to have their email address, and it's also going to have some of their generalized information. Now, as you can see, it's got kind of my default information for how it's going to be processing information. Each user can have their stuff associated individually based upon who they are. So for each user, you can have an incoming, outgoing, and tasks and appointments option. If I wanted to, I could apply the default email settings, and this would look at whatever I had previously configured and then adjust that accordingly. But in this case, I can just go ahead and set this to whatever I want for this user. Then I have to go ahead and approve the email. And this is a very important step. If I don't approve the email, then I run into situations where it doesn't allow me to process that information as I'm moving forward. So the approving the email is the first and foremost step in regards to working through it. Once the email has been approved, then I can do what is called test and enable mailbox. So you have to approve the email first, then you go ahead and hit test and enable, and this will run a test and just ensure that everything is going to work and make sure everything is okay. And then you can go ahead, and once that's approved, then it will start processing email. So that's why, if you remember, there was a couple of times where it said you have pending emails because things haven't been approved. It won't process emails for a user account until you test and enable the mailbox. So the first thing you want to do is come in, make your changes to the profile, hit save. Once you save it, then you can approve the email address. After the email address has been approved, then you can test and enable. You saw that first time when I hit approve, I got a little bit of a message. That's just because I didn't save it. Once you save the profile, you can approve the mailbox and then do a test and enable. And once the test has been done and processed, then it will come in here and refresh and tell you that everything looks okay. And once you know that everything has worked okay, then you can go ahead and start using and sending and receiving email inside Dynamics 365. Sometimes just using individual users is not really going to be conducive to what it is that you want to accomplish in the application. And so sometimes using teams can be a real beneficial option. What teams are groups of users that you're kind of categorizing together. So for example, you might have sales users, and you might want to create a team for sales users. And the reason why you would do that is now you can assign security roles to that team to use for ownership scenarios. Let me give you a good example of that around like enterprise level accounts. So you might, if you're working in a traditional kind of small business scenario, you might have one sales rep or one account executive that manages a specific account. They're in charge, they're the owner. But when you start talking about large scale opportunities at an enterprise level, you might have teams of people that are managing that account together. So instead of assigning that account to an individual user and then having to share it out with all the other subsequent team members, you would be able to actually assign that account to a team. And now everybody who's a member of that team can own that account together. And now they can collaborate and they can work with information from there. The teams can be used for a variety of different things. They can be used for record sharing. They can be used for field security profiles. They have a lot of different options that you can be working with when you start talking about teams. Now, teams can just exist and you can just use them for record sharing, or teams can actually have a security role. Just like a user could have a security role, a team can have a security role assigned to them that basically tells us how that information is going to work when they're going through it. So now these individual team members can manage these items together. There's two types of teams in a Dynamics 365 implementation. There's what are called owner teams, and there's what are called access teams. And so let's just talk a little bit about what an owner team is versus an access team. So an owner team is exactly what it would sound like. An owner team is a group of users who will be owning records inside the application. So instead of having just an individual user, you're going to have a group of people owning a record together. Typically, when you're using owner teams, these are teams that you're going to know kind of who the members are ahead of time. So you're going to know that the enterprise team consists of these 5 people, or the admin team consists of these 5 people. So they're pretty static when you're creating them inside the application, and they can be used from a reporting perspective. An access team is a little bit different. An access team is basically saying, I don't necessarily know who's going to need access to a specific record on any given time. So I want to be able to kind of dynamically associate that with individual users. So what an access team does is it uses a concept of a subgrid on an individual record, and as you add members to that subgrid, it automatically creates this access team and then adds and removes members of that team automatically. This is great whenever you need kind of those dynamic capabilities, and when you have different rights that you might want to work with as part of those. And we're going to show you just a little bit around both of those. We won't necessarily show you the subgrid component, but we'll talk about the access teams and the templates around each one of those as part of the demonstration. So let's first just look at teams in general. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on teams. And you'll see that this shows me kind of all the different teams that are associated with this organization. Now, when a item is created, let me actually switch this here. When an item is created like a business unit, a team is automatically created for that business unit. And those teams, and that's where you see this all teams here, those teams you can't really manage memberships on. The memberships of those teams are automatically controlled from within Dynamics 365. So as I add users to the sales business unit or the service business unit, or I remove users from those business units, the application itself is going to kind of dynamically control who is a member of those teams. So those I don't necessarily have the capabilities to tweak, but I can create my own teams kind of as necessary. So I could, for example, go into new, and it's going to say, okay, what do I want to do here? I'm going to call this sample team. I'm going to define who the administrator is going to be for this team, and I'll just make myself the administrator. And then what is the team type? Is it going to be an owner team or an access team? Typically speaking, if you're going in and you're manually creating a team, it's probably going to be an owner team. And the reason why it's going to be an owner team is because these are going to be the teams that, generally speaking, will create records. Usually with access teams, you could define it as an access team, but when you start creating access teams, it's much easier to use what are called access team templates to kind of facilitate that. So in this case, we'll just create this as an owner team. Now I'll go ahead and hit save, and that'll save the team. And now I can add users. So in here where it says team members, now I can come in here, I can hit add team, and now I could look to define who are going to be the members of this team. So I'll add myself, maybe add the CRM admin, and then I just kind of define my team members from here. At any point, if I wanted to, I could convert this record to an access team. I also could assign security roles, and we're not going to do a bunch with security roles quite yet, just because we're going to revisit those in the next module. But this is where, if I wanted to use this for truly owning records, this is where I could define a security role associated with this team. So that's an ownership team. Let me close out of here real quick. And let's go back into security and access team templates. An access team template is a little bit different. An access team template is what you can use to kind of dynamically share records inside the application. And so what ends up happening is you enable an entity for access teams. So if you go into the settings and customizations and you click on the entity definition, there's an option there that says access teams, and you check the box for access teams. Then you can come in here and create an access team template. And then what happens in here when you create this template, I'm going to just call this sample template. You pick the entity, so in this case, it's only going to show the entities that have access teams enabled. And then you pick what rights you want them to have. So I want them to be able to read, and I want them to be able to write. And then I can hit save and close. And so now what happens is whenever somebody is added to this subgrid or whenever somebody is associated with this access team, they are going to get write and read privileges to this particular record. Now we'll show you this when we get into kind of another module. We'll show you the actual practical application of this, but it's something that has to be kind of modified on the form itself. But this is at least the precursor to how you can set that up. You'll notice we're not setting up the teams, we're just defining the templates. The teams actually get created automatically when you add this subgrid that references this access team template to a specific record. Dynamics 365 provides you with several different configuration screens that you can use when you want to modify specific settings inside the application. Maybe like auto numbering for specific entities or working with document management settings. Each of these options are organization specific, which means that they only apply to the organization that you're working in. However, a lot of these options can be included in solutions when you're working with it and imported into other environments and other scenarios. So the nice thing about using your configuration settings is you really do have the capabilities to go in, like with your duplicate detection, and set up how you want to handle duplicate detection inside the application. You also have that as a baseline for your security principles inside the application. And this is where you can start with kind of your cornerstone of security, which is business units, which are really the framework for how you want to handle Dynamics 365 security inside the application. From there, you then have to go in and set up your users. So each user that you want to work with will have to have a specific user account. The process for creating users is going to differ slightly depending upon whether or not you're doing online or on-premise customers, but regardless of what the method is, once the user is authenticated to the application, then the Dynamics 365 security module is going to take over, which we're actually going to talk a little bit more about in the next module from that perspective. As you're working through it, typically speaking, you will see that access and control is generally handled at a user level. However, there are situations where teams can come into play. And the nice thing with teams is they do give you the capabilities to actually have a little bit more flexibility on how you want to handle who owns specific records inside the application, as well as how you want to facilitate sharing data amongst individual users as well.